This is one of those stories I've been sitting on for a really long time. It happened back when I was maybe 25 or 26, way before I met my wife and way before we had kids. I was a completely different person back then. Not in a bad way, just in the sense that I had the kind of free time and risk tolerance that I genuinely can't relate to anymore. I used to do these solo backpacking trips a few times a year, usually somewhere in the Appalachians. I'd drive out to some remote trailhead, hike deep into the backcountry, way off the trail, and spend a few days completely off the grid. No cell service, no other people, nothing. I loved it. My friends thought I was insane, and honestly, I kind of was. This particular trip was in the Cherokee National Forest, and it changed how I see backpacking forever. I had been out there for 2 days, and everything had been going perfectly. The weather had been great, the trail was quiet, and I hadn't seen another person since the first morning. That changed pretty quickly, though. On the afternoon of the second day, I noticed dark storm clouds building up to the west. I wasn't too worried at first. I'd hiked through rain plenty of times, and it was never a big deal. But within about an hour, I realized it wasn't going to be a passing shower. The wind picked up hard, and the temperature dropped fast enough that I actually stopped to put on another layer. By the time the rain started, I was already looking for a spot to hunker down. The problem was that I was in a pretty exposed section of the trail. As I predicted, it wasn't a light rain. It went from windy to full-on downpour in minutes. The wind was bending smaller trees sideways, and I could hear branches cracking and falling in the canopy above me. I started getting genuinely concerned about my safety. Lightning was striking pretty close by, and I was hiking at elevation with a metal-framed pack on my back. Not ideal. I kept pushing forward, completely soaked at that point. I was scanning the woods on either side of the trail for anything that could pass as shelter. As if by some miracle, I actually saw a structure through the trees off to my left. It was small and dark and partially hidden by the forest, but it was unmistakably man-made. As I got closer, I realized it was a tiny, one-story cabin. They looked extremely old, like it could have been a hunting cabin or a homesteader's shelter from decades ago. There was a single window on the side I was approaching. I can't overstate how relieved I was. I practically sprinted over to the thing and pushed the door open. Inside, it was dim but dry. There wasn't much in there, just a chair, a small table, and what looked like a cot frame pushed against the far wall. There was a stone fireplace on the right side that was clogged with old ash and debris. The place honestly smelled really bad, but I didn't care about anything other than stripping out of my soaked clothes and laying down. There wasn't a couch or anything in there, so I literally just picked a spot on the floor and lied down. I was in survival mode at that point, not exploration mode. All I cared about was that I was out of the storm. It wasn't until I'd been inside for maybe 10 or 15 minutes that I started actually looking around. With the storm raging outside, there wasn't much else to do besides flick on a flashlight and snoop, so that's exactly what I did. There was more stuff in that cabin than I had initially realized. For starters, there was a sleeping bag rolled up in the corner near the cot frame. It didn't look ancient like the rest of the place, which confused me. There were also a couple of cans and water jugs on the table, which made me think someone had been using the place as a base camp of sorts. Maybe another backpacker or a hunter. It wasn't unusual to find stuff like that in remote cabins, but the more I looked around, the more things started bothering me. There were marks on the wall near the door. At first I thought they were just damage from age or weather, but when I got closer to inspect them, I could see they were scratches. There were dozens of them, some shallow and some deeper. There was no pattern or order to the marks, at least not one I could see. I stepped back and looked at the door itself. The handle was a simple latch, which wasn't unusual. Despite the storm, I opened the door just to get a look at the mechanism. There was a metal bracket on the outside of the frame, which looked like it was designed to hold a padlock. The bracket was on the outside. There was no corresponding latch on the inside. That meant the door could only be locked from the outside. Things only got stranger. I shut the door and started looking around the cabin. The only thing I hadn't checked out yet was the window, so I walked over to it. The glass was still perfectly intact, which surprised me given the apparent age of the place. But then I noticed why. There were screws drilled into the window frame, one in each corner securing it shut. Those had also been driven in from outside, and around the edges of the frame on the inside, there were more scratches, deep ones. These were unmistakable. They honestly looked like someone had tried to pry the window open with their bare hands. All of it hit me at once. Someone had been kept in this cabin, trapped, as in kept against their will. I should have left right then, and I did consider that, but there was a good part of me that felt like whatever had gone on in that cabin was well in the past. Everything in the cabin looked really old. Even the sleeping bag, which did look on the newer side admittedly, was rigid and dusty. Plus, the last thing I wanted to do was go back out in that storm again, so I stayed. I'm not sure how much time passed, maybe an hour, maybe more. The storm wasn't letting up at all. If anything, it had gotten worse. The rain on the roof was so loud that it was hard to hear much of anything else. That's probably why it took me so long to notice the other sound. I picked up on the scratching or scraping noises from outside, somewhere along the left wall of the cabin. At first, I thought it was a branch, but I couldn't remember if there had been branches low enough to even touch the exterior of the cabin. As I was thinking about it, I heard 2 heavy thumps on the porch. They honestly didn't sound like storm sounds. This time I stood up. I did that thing where you freeze in place and try to focus by staring at a random spot on the wall. I was trying to listen, but if someone was moving out there, it would have been impossible to hear over the storm. I started getting paranoid that those sounds I heard were just a few of many, and that the rest had been drowned out by the rain. My eyes drifted over to the window. I couldn't bring myself to look through it. If someone really was out there, they'd probably be looking through it. I stayed in that position for what felt like forever. After a while, I started to relax a bit, thinking I had just been hearing the storm, or at the very worst, an animal poking around the cabin. I was almost ready to forget about everything when I heard something that sent me over the edge. Pressure on the door, like someone was leaning their full weight against it from the other side. The wood creaked and the latch rattled once before the pressure released. My heart rate instantly shot back up, and that's when something clicked. Why would someone be outside in a storm like this, circling the cabin, tapping on the walls, without just coming in? The door wasn't locked. Nothing was stopping them. And then I thought about what I'd found inside the cabin, and it occurred to me that maybe whoever was out there didn't want to come inside. Maybe they wanted me to stay inside. Maybe the whole point was to keep me in there. I don't know if that was the right conclusion or if my mind was just spiraling, but I decided I was leaving right then. I didn't care about the storm. I started moving things into my backpack as fast as I could. I had the sickening feeling that something really bad was about to happen, and I was right. The next few moments were a blur. I was maybe 30 seconds from walking out the door when I heard the sound of glass shattering behind me. I spun around just in time to see something come through the window, and that was all I could see before the whole room erupted in flames. The flames spread so fast that I couldn't even process what was happening. One second I was standing in a dark room, and the next second the walls were on fire. The heat hit me like a physical wall, and the door wouldn't budge. It was jammed from the outside. I slammed into it with all my might, and it gave. It collapsed off its hinges, and me with it. I scrambled to get back on my feet, and I just ran. I couldn't even see. I was just running wildly through the woods and rain, trying to put as much distance between myself and that cabin. But before I could get a safe distance away, I felt something tackle me from behind, and I was back on the ground. There was a person on top of me, and suddenly I was fighting for my life. I clawed and kicked and screamed, but this guy wouldn't get off me. He was yelling too, and he kept trying to get me in a chokehold. He was gouging at my eyes and pulling my hair, and I started to feel dizzy, but I managed to push him off. I got back up and kept running, and whoever had just tried to kill me was screaming like a maniac. I looked back twice. I couldn't see my attacker, but I did see the cabin, which was fully engulfed in flames. I think the picture of that fireball is burned into my brain forever. The second time I looked back, the glow was smaller but still visible through the woods, but I just kept running. For all I knew, I was being chased. I didn't stop until my legs gave out. I found a spot where a couple of large trees had fallen against each other, and there was a narrow gap underneath that blocked most of the rain. I crawled under there and just collapsed. I couldn't feel my body. I don't know if it was the fire, the rain, or the attack. Maybe all three, but I was completely numb. All I did was sit in that crouched position and try to keep breathing. I don't know how many hours passed under those trees, but time lost all meaning. Eventually, I felt some feelings start to re-enter my body, and I told myself it was move or die. Whoever was out there was probably looking for me, and he couldn't have been that far away. So I got up and started moving through the woods. I didn't know where the trail was, but I didn't really care. I honestly can't tell you how I survived that night, but I did. I stumbled onto a random trail and just followed it. I was soaked and probably bleeding from multiple places, but I just kept trudging on. Eventually, the rain subsided a bit, at least enough for me to figure out where I was. I made it to some random trailhead. By that point, the storm had passed. I don't remember too much after that. All I remember is that the first person I saw drove me to a hospital. I had second-degree burns on my left forearm and the back of my neck, and doctors told me I was lucky I hadn't inhaled more smoke than I did. None of it was permanent, but it hurt like hell for a long time afterwards. By the time I was healed and safe at home, I told myself I would never camp or hike alone again. Someone had intentionally set that cabin on fire to kill me. That's the only thing that makes any sense. It was pouring rain, a full-blown thunderstorm, and the roof was metal. There's no way a wooden structure goes up like that fast unless the wood had been treated with something beforehand. I gave the police everything, or as much as I could, but I could tell they weren't really going to do anything. And to be fair, I wasn't in a charted part of the woods, so it would have been silly to hound them. The only thing I don't understand is the timing of everything. My wife would probably tell you I stopped doing solo trips because I grew up and got more responsible, and she's not entirely wrong, but I honestly never told her about this incident. And I know I'll never go backcountry trekking again alone. My name is James. This happened maybe 7 or 8 years ago, back when I was in my early 20s and still doing stuff that I probably shouldn't have been doing. I had this friend Charles who was kind of notorious in our friend group for finding cool places to explore, like abandoned buildings and old factories. If it was somewhere you weren't supposed to be, Charles had probably already been there and can tell you exactly how to get in. He spent a weird amount of time on Google Earth and these niche urbex forums, and he'd always be hitting the group chat with screenshots of random places he wanted to check out. Most of us would entertain his ideas, but never actually follow through. I was usually the exception. Charles and I had been friends since high school, and I think the reason we got along so well was that we had similar thresholds for risk. While most of our friends would hear his pitches and go, "That sounds insane," I'd hear them and go, "When are we going?" It was a dynamic that led to some great memories and a few situations that I look back on now and genuinely wonder how we made it out unscathed. This story is about one of those situations. One weekend, Charles texted me about a fire lookout tower he'd found deep in some forest not far away from us. I really wish I could remember the name of the forest, but I can't. Charles said it had been decommissioned years ago and was just sitting out there in the middle of nowhere, completely untouched. He didn't tell me how he'd found it, but I didn't want to know. He was convinced we could hike out to it, climb it, and spend the night up there. I was more skeptical. I mean, things like that are usually fenced off or at least protected somehow, but I promised him I'd at least come and check it out. To be fair, the idea of being 70 feet or so up in the middle of a forest with a 360-degree view sounded incredible to me. We picked a random weekend and made it happen. Charles planned the entire thing out, including the drive, what to pack, and how to find the tower once we were in the woods. It was a 3-hour drive away, and Charles told me the hike would be off the trail, but pretty short, about 4 miles or so. We drove out early in the morning on Friday and made it into the woods sometime in the afternoon. For some reason, I was kind of expecting us to get lost, or at the very least not find the tower, which is exactly why I was all the more astonished when we actually did. Seeing it through the trees for the first time was an insane sight. I remember blurting out "no fucking way" when I saw how tall it was. I was even more astonished when we got to the base of it and realized it was completely unprotected or fenced off. It was just sitting there in the middle of the woods waiting for us to find it. The cab at the top was this small square room with windows on all 4 sides. There was a metal staircase that zigzagged up the frame with a section of vertical ladder for the final stretch up to the cab. The whole thing looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Some of the lower railings were bent or missing, and there was graffiti on the support beams near the base. To be completely honest, it did not look like the type of structure anyone would be eager to climb, but Charles was practically giddy. While I was hesitating and debating whether I should try convincing him to back out, he had already started climbing. I yelled at him to be careful, and that got him to slow down. I figured what the hell, and told myself to stop bitching. The two of us made our way up carefully, checking the stairs as we went. Most of them felt solid enough, but there were a few spots where the bolts had rusted through and the steps wobbled. The vertical ladder section near the top was the sketchiest part. It was 20-something feet of straight climbing with nothing but a narrow metal cage around it. The adrenaline rush was insane, but that's what Charles lived for. He made it up without any issues. The view from the cab was unreal. You could see for miles in every direction. We had also timed it perfectly. The sun was maybe an hour from setting. Our plan was to camp out for the night and catch the sunrise. There was a decently wide wraparound walkway up there, which is where we decided to chill, at least initially. We cracked a few beers and just enjoyed the view and some conversation. The sun eventually went down, and the sky went from orange to purple to dark blue in a matter of minutes. Once the light was gone, the forest below us was just a black mess in every direction. There wasn't a single light in sight. The stars were incredible, easily the best I've ever seen. But being alone out there in the dark was freaking me out a little. It was just weird not being able to see anything, despite knowing there was a whole forest below us. Charles could tell I was getting a little antsy, and he started messing with me, grabbing my shoulder and stuff like that. But the thing that pissed me off the most was when he smacked his metal water bottle against the side of the tower. It sent this incredibly loud, echoing clang in every direction, probably to be heard for miles. The sound was so loud and ominous that I actually got mad at him. I told him I wanted to go inside the cab, and he finally got the hint. There wasn't much in there, by the way. It had clearly been hollowed out ages ago. He said he was going to finish his beer before coming in and joining me, and I was fine with that. I picked a random corner and started setting my sleeping stuff up. But before I could finish, he told me in a very quiet, serious voice to come back outside. Very un-Charles-like. So I did. I walked back around to where he was sitting and saw that he was pointing diagonally downwards, toward the forest below us. At first, I thought he was just messing with me again, but it only took me a few seconds to realize what he was pointing at. There was a light down there. It was faint and pretty far away, but it was definitely down there, and it was genuinely horrifying. It was weaving through the forest at what seemed like walking pace, and my first thought was that it was a person who'd heard the clang from the tower. I don't know why I felt the urge to whisper, but I did. I told him he was stupid for doing that, and we were probably moments away from getting caught or arrested or something. He looked at me with this confused expression before saying, "You think that's a person?" Now it was my turn to be confused. What the hell was he talking about? I asked him what else it could be, and he said that light was moving way too evenly. He wasn't exactly wrong. The light wasn't swinging or wobbling the way you'd expect someone carrying a lantern or flashlight to be. But then again, it was probably too far away to tell. I didn't say anything after that. Neither did Charles. He just kept staring at this mysterious light as it continued weaving through the forest. Part of me thought it was just some random hiker that had nothing to do with us, but I knew that was wishful thinking. After a few minutes, it was obvious that the light was getting closer. It was also much clearer that the light was moving perfectly, like it was floating or hovering. Charles asked me what we should do, and I didn't have an answer for him. There wasn't really anything we could do. Like, what were we gonna do, climb down? As we were throwing out more theories, the light suddenly zipped forward, like it skipped a beat. It was really thick, but for a split second that light went from steady, even movement to an abrupt zip forward. Then it was back to steady movement again. I started feeling my palms start to sweat, and I could tell Charles was really freaked out too. I kept trying to convince myself that whoever was down there was just wandering aimlessly through the woods, but again, wishful thinking. They were definitely heading for the tower, and after about 10 minutes, they reached it. At that point, the light was directly below us, and I was bracing myself for someone to yell up to us and announce themselves as police. But no, the light just stopped moving and stayed in that exact spot right below us. From our vantage point straight above, we could see the light itself, but not whoever was holding it. Charles and I stared at it for a while. The suspense was killing me, but it must have been killing Charles even more, because he again did something I wanted to throw him off the tower for. This guy actually yelled, "Hey, are you good?" down at the light, revealing our presence. I looked at him in horror. I genuinely couldn't believe he would do something so stupid. We didn't get a response though, and the light didn't even move. We waited a little bit, and then Charles yelled down again, but still nothing. So there we were, 70 feet up in an abandoned fire tower in the middle of nowhere, with someone or something blocking our only exit. We were completely trapped. We must have watched that light for 30 minutes straight, whispering to each other every so often. It never moved once. I wasn't worried about being secretive anymore. Charles had burned that bridge a long time ago, so I did something I should have done a while ago. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it straight down at the base of the tower. But even after I did that, I still couldn't see the source of the light. Eventually, we accepted that there was nothing we could do and tried to go back to what we were doing. We went back to talking, but I made sure I never took my eyes off that light for more than a few seconds. Charles thought it was some kind of LED that someone had placed there to mess with us, but who the hell would bother doing that? At some point, Charles said he was going to climb down and check it out, and I told him that was insane. Not only was that inviting trouble, but it was downright stupid and dangerous. As we were arguing about it, I glanced down and realized that I couldn't see the light anymore. There was just darkness and more darkness down there again. I frantically scanned the emptiness below us with my eyes, looking for the light, but it wasn't there anymore. Charles seemed relieved, but I was the opposite. He kept telling me to relax, saying whoever had been there had probably left, but I was more freaked out than I had been when the light was just sitting there motionlessly. The thought that someone could be down there, and now we couldn't even see them, was terrifying to me. Charles reassured me that we'd obviously be able to hear if anyone tried to climb the ladder, which I guessed was true, but I was still really unsettled. Suddenly, I didn't want to be in the open air anymore. I suggested that we wait out the rest of the night from inside the cab, and he agreed. So we went inside and set up our sleeping bags. Neither of us were going to sleep, though. That was suicide. Staying awake turned out to be the right decision, because not 20 minutes after going inside, we started hearing noises. The first ones were all metallic clangs that echoed up through the steel frame of the tower. They weren't footsteps, which I want to be crystal clear about, because I was listening specifically for footsteps, and this was not that. It sounded more like someone struck one of the support beams with a wrench or a crowbar. A few minutes later, another one came. This one was more of a grinding sound, like metal being twisted against metal, and it lasted for a good few seconds before stopping. Charles and I kept looking at each other like we were expecting the other one to do something, but there was nothing we could do. The sounds kept coming from what sounded like different spots, which was what really got me because it meant whatever was causing them was moving down there. The sounds continued on and off for a while. I kept trying to map out the sounds in my head, figure out where they were coming from, how many sources there were, whether they were getting closer or staying at the same level. I couldn't make sense of any of it. Charles and I were whispering to each other about what we'd do if we started hearing someone walking up. I was sitting against the far wall of the cab, facing the windows on the opposite side. Charles was on the opposite side, looking over my shoulder. There were so many windows in there that we didn't feel safe and wanted to be able to see out of all of them. There wasn't much to see though. They were all pretty dark, with the only light being from the stars and the moon. But then I saw something. A dark outline moved across the glass. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing fast enough, but then it passed in front of the next pane over, and that's what did it. I couldn't help but yell, and Charles scrambled away from the window. The two of us immediately ran over to the door and pressed our backs against it. If someone tried to come through that door, they were going to have to push through both of us. I kept looking for the figure through the windows, but I couldn't see anything. That was impossible, though. Unless they were crawling on all fours, I should have been able to see them. Charles and I sat up like that for a really long time, and I could hear him hyperventilating. What followed was the most tense and terrifying few hours of my life. Charles and I sat there in that exact position like our lives depended on it. By the time the sun started coming up, I was completely exhausted. When it was finally light enough to see, I counted to 3 and then swung the door open violently, expecting someone to be crouching behind it, but there was no one there. Charles and I ran around the side of it to confirm that, and it was clear. I looked down to the base of the tower, and there was nothing down there either. We grabbed our stuff and started descending as fast as we could. We made it about 3/4 of the way down the staircase before Charles stopped in front of me. He just stood on the landing, staring down at the next section of stairs. I looked past him and saw it immediately. An entire section of the staircase was gone. It wasn't just a few steps. I'm talking about an entire section of stairs, straight up missing. It was impossible, but we were staring at it. Someone had deconstructed an entire section of staircase during the night while we were sitting directly above them. That must have been what those sounds were, but that didn't make sense. The noises didn't stop until after I had seen the person up there. So had they really crossed that gap twice? In the dark? No way. Plus, there's absolutely no chance someone could have done that without us hearing it. That would have been a lot louder than a few clangs here and there. We stood on that landing for a while, trying to figure out what to do. We had to just jump across. It wasn't that far, but it was still scary. Charles ended up twisting his ankle, but I was fine. We made it the rest of the way down, and that was that. There was no one waiting for us at the bottom. There was actually nothing there at all, including the metal steps that had been removed, at least as far as we could tell. Granted, we didn't look around too much. It didn't make any sense, but we weren't sticking around. I still don't have an explanation for any of it. Not the light, not the sounds, not the figure I saw outside the window, and definitely not how someone managed to remove an entire section of steel staircase in the middle of the night without us hearing it. Every time I see Charles, this is something we still talk about.